Welcome back to the shop, everybody. Now I know it's been over a couple of days since the last video. Truth of the matter is that we've had a lot of projects going on here in the shop, and none of them have really rated their own individual video, and some of them are content that we're going to do other stuff with in the future. What I'd really like to do is kind of throw it all together and let you guys just see all of it, all the little tidbits, and bring them all together in this, the 6th variety show. So first things first, let's talk about one of the bigger projects I've done recently. This giant assembly table.
And this is a really basic design. I wanted it to be 8 feet by 4 feet because conveniently plywood comes in that size as well. I used a couple pieces of 3/4 inch thick plywood, glued and screwed them together for the top. The legs are going to be just 4x4 studs, and I used some 2x4s to kind of frame them in. The joinery is just some glue and deck screws, nothing fancy here. I made 3 of these frames for a total of 6 legs on the table, as you probably just noticed as well. I fit the base to the top with a bunch of pocket holes.
Once the table was complete, I decided I wanted to add a vise to it, and this vise, it's pretty heavy, maybe heavy duty. It actually came with the shop when we moved in. I don't think it's anything fancy. It seems to be just kind of a nondescript import vise, but like I said, it's nice and heavy. I don't feel bad if something does happen to it. It has a couple axes of rotation. And here pretty recently, I just added a pair of aluminum soft jaws to it. Now these are just plain jaws, but they're nice and true and flat. They won't mar any parts that are harder than aluminum, which is great for doing finishing operations and other light work on parts that come off the mill or off the lathe. The jaws themselves I machined on my CNC machine. I had actually taken measurements of the original jaws a couple of years ago to 3D print a set of soft jaws. Actually, you can see them in the video I do of the review of the ANET E10 3D printer.
Immediately after building the assembly table, I was still kind of shifted into woodworker gears, so I wanted to make a workbench to put the South Bend lathe on. The idea being that it would raise the height of the lathe, make it a little bit more comfortable to use, and give me a little bit more workspace and maybe a place to put a chip pan, things of that nature. I didn't mind the cast iron legs on the lathe, I just wanted to try to upgrade them. I used it for about a week, and ultimately I just didn't like it. It just didn't feel as stable as the cast iron legs. I even tried reinforcing it, and tried all sorts of adjustments to it to try to get it a little bit more rigid. But in the end, I went with the old South Bend cast iron legs. They're just stronger and more stable. One of the big ideas I've had for a while is to make a steady rest for the South Bend lathe by 3D printing a pattern and then casting it in aluminum. This is a project I undertook earlier this year. It was still bitter cold outside, which actually gave me a number of problems with the sand. The pattern too was also not perfect, and I've since made a few modifications in hopes that in the future it'll come out better. I did several attempts of just trying to make a basic sand mold, and they all pretty much failed. I kind of needed the steady rest for a project, so I went ahead and found one on eBay that was listed as being for a South Bend lathe, and when it showed up, it definitely was not. As you can see, it did not line up at all. I think this is for the import 9x20 lathes. So that left me with the options of either sending it back and starting at square one again, or to try to make this one work, and that's the path I chose. After taking some measurements, I was able to cut off the extra stock on the bottom of it, and then fit it to the ways of the lathe with a hand file. The finish isn't great right here, but I did end up smoothing it out with some sandpaper, and I think there's still enough meat on the bone I could lap it or scrape it in. This was a good exercise in both hand precision and patience. The other modification I made to the steady rest was on these fingers. Are they called fingers? Arms? Legs? Anyway, I laid out and then drilled holes so I could mount bearings to the tips of them. And this allowed whatever workpiece was inside the steady rest to be turned smoothly. And it came out pretty well. I think it holds concentricity to the chuck, at least as best as I can measure, and it'll allow me to work on longer pieces in the South Bend lathe. Earlier this summer, I picked up this tripod. It's for those halogen work lights. I found it at a junk shop for, I think, $2 or $3. I always have an eye for things like this because they're just so damn handy for anything. I decided that this would become a roller support stand for long items in my horizontal bandsaw. Now, this is the kind of project that makes no sense to spend any money on. I went through the shop looking for all the scrap I had. I had some round tubing and some of this channel iron. My brother-in-law actually picked this up on the side of the road and dropped it off a year or two ago. The channel iron is a perfect size to fit in the top of this tripod.
So I got this shop oven here, and it's really nice. See, I built the high temperature oven last year for heat treating stuff and making stuff really hot. It doesn't have a lot of space in it, and there's a lot of things that I don't need to make really hot, but do need to bake, like Cerakote, powder coat, other bake-on finishes, things of that nature, tempering metals, preheating stuff for welding, things of that nature. So this oven I actually got, it's a wall unit, like a built-in, and I got it from the Habitat for Humanity Restore. It's kind of funny because it was a location that was closing. I bought the plug to wire it so I could just plug it into my welding outlet. The wood to make a stand, and then a filing cabinet to put under that stand to hold all the stuff for this part of the shop, all the kind of warm temperature stuff. And I think I spent less than $5 total.
I had the need for some clamps that had very specifically shaped jaws. It was complex shape, so the solution is obviously to cut this out on the CNC milling machine. I wanted to kind of give the milling machine a little bit of a heads up with material removal, so using prints from the CAD file, I made a stencil that I could go back in and then drill out a lot of this extra waste stock that's just being cut out. So on the drill press, we just cut along the lines. This really only took about 10 minutes. The idea being that we could then clean up this cut in the milling machine, and it would make it nice and perfect with a little 2D path, and we wouldn't have to worry about all that material removal. This worked really well. The only issues I experienced was in the work holding process. See, I'm using the superglue and tape method, which is awesome, but not really ideal for this particular part because of the size, the depth, the interrupted cuts causing kind of a bit of vibration, and superglue doesn't cure very well in the extreme cold, and it was extremely cold when I was doing this. The part did eventually free itself when we were about 3/4 of the way through it, which is a shame, but we were able to save the part completely. I just touched it up on the belt sander. I had to hand fit it with a file anyway. So the lessons learned was that the material removal method I used actually worked pretty well. I would use that again in the future for such a simple path. The other lesson being, when it's time to use a vise, just use a vise.
Earlier this year, I ran air lines through this wall of the shop. This is a kit you can get. It comes with a few manifolds and some flexible PEX tubing with some push-to-connect connectors. So it's really easy to install. I've got it on one wall of the shop, so it runs to all the machines I need it for right now. Makes running air a lot easier, especially on the milling machine. And now I have a little air outlet on the lathe as well. This is, I believe, the literal smallest kit that this company sells, and that's fine. It actually suits my needs really well. I can make more manifolds out of aluminum if I wish to. I can very easily continue expanding the air lines all around the shop as I need to, which will happen in the future. And it came with plenty of that flexible hose. And my air compressor is probably the weakest point in my entire air system, so I definitely look forward to upgrading that in the future. So anyway, that was my little collection of not ready for prime time projects I've kind of collected clips of over the last few months. I don't blame you if you don't believe me, but I've got a lot more projects coming out really soon that I've been working on. Definitely stay tuned for those, and if you haven't already hit that subscribe button, go ahead and do so. You can also check me out on Instagram. That's probably the other social media I use the most, and you can see some kind of behind-the-scenes stuff, as well as a little bit more regular update kind of posts on there. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you soon.